Lieutenant Nora Evans had been awake since 0430. The sun hadn't cracked the horizon yet, and the ops tent still hummed with generator static and the faint clink of metal mugs. Her name sat on the assignment board, third from the bottom, listed beside one word in red, grease pencil, reserve. No call sign, no flight designation. She zipped her flight suit up to her collarbone and looped her gloves through her belt the same way she had every day since her first rotation. Her boots were already dusted and secure, laces triple knotted. There was no one else on the flight line yet. That was the point. Her UH-60L Blackhawk sat in the corner lot, nose pointed southeast. The forward skids bore light abrasion from the last terrain set down, but the frame held steady. She ran her fingers beneath the tail rotor casing, feeling for loose vibration pins or heat lines. Everything was intact. She circled once more before stepping into the crew compartment. The medkit shelf had been restocked by her own hand the night before. She didn't trust generic reissues. The trauma gauze had a tighter seal, and she preferred the 4-point litters over the collapsible slings. She clipped a Sharpie to the inside panel and slid a new IV bag into the rack. Nothing fancy, just what worked. At 0502, she sat in the pilot seat. The console smelled faintly of electrical grease and dried sweat. Her left hand hovered over the master power, not to start anything, just to feel the familiarity of layout. Switches stayed in neutral. Brake lever confirmed. Throttle idle. Everything ready. Everything cold. She pulled a folded sheet from her knee pocket. It was a terrain overlay chart she'd compiled by hand, copied from last month's radar drift data. Altitude notes ran in narrow ink lines along the margin. She traced one corner with her thumb, then refolded it precisely and tucked it back. It didn't matter if she flew today. She would know where the wind channeled near the saddle line. Back in the hangar bay, another crew shuffled by with half-laced boots and coffee steam rising from their mugs. One tech laughed about a movie download that failed overnight. Nobody looked her way. She moved past the noise and headed for the secondary locker room. Inside her bin were the same 3 items she always kept ready. One laminated mission card pack, each sheet indexed by flight corridor, one spare pair of wool socks, one medallion in a zip pouch. Not for luck, just memory. She adjusted the strap on her helmet. The sweatband had been replaced last week, not because anyone told her to, but because the old one smelled like another pilot's long shift. She didn't like that. Her name tag had peeled slightly from the edge, so she pressed it back down. At 0536, she was back on the tarmac, watching heat shimmer from the exhaust ducts of a maintenance truck. She stood at the edge of the crew lot while a pair of pilots, both in undershirts and ball caps, tossed a ration bar between them like a football. One of them mimicked a tower call in a bad accent. The other pretended to mishear. Laughter. Then more coffee. No one questioned why she wasn't in the tent. She wasn't listed. She wasn't on the flight block. She wasn't needed. She still ran her hands down the door panel and felt for microfractures along the lower edge of the port side cowling. Nothing. She checked the rotor hub once more. The trim bolt had held, torque balance steady. Even if no one flew her bird today, it would be ready for the next one who did. By 0551, she entered the briefing tent and stood at the back wall. The projector hadn't been switched on yet. Most of the room leaned on elbows or muttered about coffee packs. The air smelled like canvas and machine oil. Colonel Morris walked in at 0601 exactly. The room hushed by instinct, not order. He pulled the board across the map rack and clipped a transparent panel over it. Weather pushed in from the northwest. Winds building to 18 knots near the ridge. Flight plans rerouted. Nora listened. She took mental notes. She did not ask questions. The call signs rolled down the column Dart 6, Bravo 2, Echo Trail. Each line confirmed with weight limits and airspeed restrictions. She watched the assignments land like routine. Her name didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just folded her arms and let the day begin as if she weren't there. The projector flared to life. Her shadow hit the back wall of the tent, stretched long by the light. Nobody turned around. After the brief ended, the pilots filed out with casual pace, some still arguing about the optimal route through the North Pass. One of them made a joke about how the outpost still stocked grape jelly instead of strawberry. Someone else pretended to care. Nora stayed behind long enough to watch the colonel erase 3 names and replace them with maintenance hold tags. One of those birds wouldn't be flight ready until after 1300. Still, no standby reassignment. She left the tent, walked straight to her aircraft, and reopened the medbay. One Velcro strap had frayed slightly at the edge. She replaced it from her belt pouch and resecured the pouch corner. She tested the latch twice. It clicked clean each time. By 0647, she stood at the edge of the shadow line, where the concrete met the sand. The Blackhawk gleamed just slightly in the rising light. Its blades were still. Its weight centered evenly across both skids. No one had spoken to her since 0510. That was fine. She was not waiting to be needed. She was already ready. At 11:08, the air inside the ops tent was warm, filtered through canvas walls and the low churn of an old ceiling fan. A few pilots leaned near the projector rack, idly swapping field rumors. Colonel Morris stood near the flight board, red marker uncapped in his hand, reviewing the remaining rotation for the day. The call came in low band. The comms tech barely looked up at first, but his face shifted when he read the repeat header twice. He stood without speaking and handed the printed slip to the colonel. Morris read it in silence. Then again, 1 Marine, critically wounded. Grid Echo 7, Northwest Ridgeline near Kirkuk. Under active contact, low visibility, unstable terrain, immediate medevac requested. The casual rhythm in the tent fractured. No alarms, no sudden shift, just a perceptible drop in ambient noise. One pilot adjusted his bootstrap for the second time. Another stood straighter without seeming to know why. Morris placed the slip on the edge of the map rack. His eyes moved to the board, scanning available crews. Dart 6 was listed, but grounded for rotor blade torque inspection. Echo Trail was flagged yellow co-pilot under 24-hour fatigue restriction. Fox Lead was still down from avionics recalibration. He ran a thumb down the call sign list. Each name had a slash or a pending note. No one spoke. Outside, the wind shifted. Canvas pulled tight along the west wall, the sound of it snapping sharp against the poles. One of the newer lieutenants stepped forward, only to hesitate. His name wasn't on the ready list. No one called him out. Morris looked at the fuel log. The only rig prepped for weight under threshold was Blackhawk 214 Lima, fully stocked. Systems cleared that morning. Flight ready. The pilot assigned to it was marked Reserve. He didn't write anything. Another officer leaned in close to check the adjacent rotation. Nothing matched. 2 birds were tagged red for maintenance. One had been cannibalized for part swaps. Another was technically available, but its powertrain had shown a pressure dip on startup. The maintenance chief had refused to clear it without full inspection. The colonel stepped back, not from fatigue, but calculation. 1 evac bird for a critical Marine, trapped in unstable mountain terrain. No weather cover, no escort, and no cleared crew. The projector screen blinked as the comms feed updated terrain overlays. Yellow shaded corridors turned amber. A few seconds later, the ridge pass nearest Echo 7 went fully red. Expected wind shear spiked above 25 knots by 14:00. If the mission launched, it would have to happen before that. Still, no one volunteered. The pilots weren't idle. They weren't unwilling. They just weren't cleared, and none of them could step forward without a green board. That was how the system worked. How it always worked. Morris stared at the bottom of the board. 1 name, marked in block letters, Evans. No call sign, no rotation stamp, just the reserve line. He tapped the marker once against his leg. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the flap. Inside, silence thickened. Someone checked their watch. Another sipped cold coffee. One of the crew chiefs near the corner began to shift tools in a pouch, though the movement served no purpose. No one laughed. No one blinked. The colonel looked back at the flight board. No one was ready, not officially. But the clock was running. She had been standing by the far column since the slip hit the board. Nothing in her posture asked for attention. Her helmet rested under one arm, chin strap tightened, and her kneeboard sat flat against her leg. No one looked at her. No one expected to. The room held in quiet suspension, every pair of eyes fixed somewhere other than the colonel. Even the younger crew had stopped checking their watches. Then, from the back of the tent, she said it. "I can take it." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't cut through the air like a challenge. It simply existed, low and even, a line delivered with the same cadence as a pre-flight call-out. Colonel Morris didn't turn right away. His eyes remained on the board. The tip of the red marker stopped against the column beside her name. A few seconds passed, but no one filled the silence. He turned just slightly, only enough to bring her into peripheral view. Her stance hadn't changed. Left boot slightly forward, shoulders squared. No tension in her jaw. No appeal. "Evans." His voice wasn't surprised. More like he'd known this was coming. Even before she spoke. She didn't move. "Your bird's ready?" "It is." She didn't elaborate. She didn't offer checklists, fuel stats, wind curves, or terrain gaps. He knew she had all of it. He looked once at the weather band, still rolling across the bottom of the projector screen. The last data point had flickered orange, updrafts building, saddle instability increasing. Still, no one else moved. "Flight path's yours, loadout's light. Keep her under threshold. Make the window." She nodded once. He didn't write her call sign. He wrote her last name, underlined it once, and stepped back. The atmosphere in the tent shifted. Not loudly, but like someone exhaled who hadn't realized they were holding air. One of the medics headed toward the hangar. A ground crew tech adjusted his headset and followed. Behind them, a corporal muttered toward the coffee maker, not quite under his breath. "We're flying dust off Barbie today." Nobody laughed. Nobody corrected him either. Nora didn't glance his way. She stepped out into the wind and headed toward her aircraft. Her boots struck the metal flooring in rhythm. Not rushed, not hesitant. The Blackhawk waited at the far end of the line, nose already turned southeast. She climbed aboard without ceremony. The checklist sat folded in the cockpit. She didn't need to open it. This was her third run-through since dawn. Hydraulic pressure green, rotor sweep clear, circuit alignment locked. She checked each point with practice touch. Switches confirmed. Seat restraints buckled clean. Her fingers moved over the control panel like tracing something she built herself. The medic arrived second, his sleeves half rolled, a field band strapped to his thigh. He stepped up, gave her one long look, then secured his rig without comment. Nora slid the HUD visor down, pulled the flight map across her knee, and checked the final descent vector. Wind was rising, but she already knew the low pass angle from memory. She adjusted one trim knob, just enough to compensate for the cross shear. Behind her, the crew sealed the cabin doors. She didn't look back. At 11:23, the skids cleared the pad in one clean motion. No dip, no overcorrection. The frame lifted steady as Nora eased into vertical ascent, left hand maintaining cyclic trim while her right held the collective firm. Fuel red full, engine pressure in the green, no instrument lag. She climbed to 800 feet AGL, then banked west by southwest, setting nose pitch -3 degrees to begin descent toward the first terrain shelf. The ridgeline ahead shimmered in haze. Wind vectors flashed yellow on her HUD overlay. She didn't need the visual. She had run this angle in her head 3 nights prior. The medic in the rear compartment strapped into the portside bench. He didn't speak. The radio was silent except for tower clearance, already confirmed. Nora adjusted torque to maintain balance through the first crosswind band. Gusts were climbing faster than predicted. She moved the flight path 10 degrees south, toward a lower contour marked on her laminated chart. The saddle cut through the ridge like a natural funnel. Air flowed unevenly through it, but with enough cushion, she could stay below the stronger updraft cells. Her fingers slid the trim knob a quarter turn. The Blackhawk responded with a faint lurch, then stabilized. She held altitude for another 15 seconds, then dropped 20 feet to avoid a rising pressure wave that would have caught the starboard skid. Cabin tremors began to build. Rotor balance wobbled with intolerance. She feathered the cyclic left, 2 degrees, compensating for terrain-induced drift. Elevation ahead rose sharply, but the approach vector stayed clean. At 11:34 they passed the first contour line. Visibility narrowed. Dust sheared sideways across the canopy. She marked a quick grease pencil line on the top right corner of the HUD to mark her descent angle. A second correction, just behind the previous one. The bird rocked once, then again. Not uncontrolled, just feedback. The nose dipped forward as she pulled collective gently, easing vertical tension without stalling torque. Instruments showed minor turbulence. She knew it would worsen near the exit point. She slid her laminated chart from its knee clip, angled it in light. The bottom contour looped into a hairpin curve, ending just east of Echo 7's beacon coordinates. That was the slot. She traced it with a gloved thumb, then folded the sheet and clipped it back. At 11:42, wind speed topped 28 knots. Nora dropped the aircraft another 40 feet, placing them below the shear band. The saddle narrowed. She set yaw 3 degrees right to counter rotational drift. Cross controls remained smooth. At the final ridge pass, the Blackhawk caught a side push, an unexpected vector curl from the north slope. The frame bucked once, hard. She kept her hands firm, didn't fight the push. Instead, she bled off speed, let the torque settle, and aligned the nose flat into the burst. Then, contact. The left skid hit first. The terrain wasn't fully level. The bird skidded, yawed slightly, and ground to a sharp stop. No rotor strike, no tail damage. But the left skid had collapsed inward at the base. The frame leaned off axis by 10 degrees. Inside, alarms blinked amber. No fire indicators. Hydraulic levels held. Engine still turning but idle. She shut the power with deliberate sequence. The bird was down, not wrecked, but they weren't flying out. She pulled the harness release and sat still for a breath, hands steady. Checklist burned into memory. Mission wasn't over. It was only about to begin. The jolt had thrown her sideways, helmet cracked, headset torn loose. The frame leaned awkwardly to port, the left skid crumpled beneath them. Nora blinked out dust and steam, her hands still on the yoke. 1 more second passed before she moved. She unbuckled clean, dropped low into the cabin space, and did a quick body check. No fractures. Bleeding from the right palm. Minor cut across her temple. She pressed her glove against her brow once, enough to slow the flow. The medic behind her was conscious but shaking. His right shoulder had taken the hit. His sleeve soaked dark to the elbow. He nodded when she pointed to his belt rig. The Marine on the litter wasn't moving. His face was gray, pulse shallow at the neck. His thigh was wrapped but bleeding through. She cut the netting loose with her rescue blade and shifted his weight against the inner cabin wall, using the tilt of the frame as a windbreak. The medkit had scattered in the roll. She crawled through loose gear and found a half-crushed IV pouch still sealed. The tubing was intact. She tore the cap off with her teeth, tied the line to a seatbelt loop, and ran the drip blind. The vein held. Gauze across the thigh rewrapped. Tighter this time. Pressure distributed with a wrist strap. Outside. The wind screamed across the slope. She forced the left door fully open using a panel shard from the broken console. Then she pulled 3 flare sticks from the crash pouch. 2 were cracked but usable. She jammed them into the gravel in a wide triangle. Open point, facing southeast standard pattern for live pickup under duress. Her gloves were gone. She didn't remember losing them. Her hands bled as she adjusted each flare base. Skin scraped raw against grit and metal. Still, the triangle stood. At 12:07, she climbed the ridge. 50 meters to the crest. No trail. No natural cover. Just slope and wind. On her third push, she used her elbows to wedge into a rock split and dragged her legs behind. Her breath came shallow. The blood from her palm smeared across the mirror as she drew it out. She lay flat against the stone and angled the mirror into the sun. 5 short flashes. Pause. Repeat. Patterned. Rhythmic. Nothing moved. She kept going. Flash. Pause. Flash. On the fifth cycle, a silhouette broke above the eastern rise. Blackhawk, scout variant, running dim lighting to avoid detection. It paused in hover until the pilot caught the flare pattern, then banked, nose turning toward the triangle. Elevation, angle, open direction, all correct. Nora stood, raised her arm in full view, palm open, slow and deliberate. She pointed to the wind line once, then stepped back. The crew chief dropped the winch cable. She steadied it herself. The medic went first, then the Marine. Only then did she reach for the cable again. They touched down at 21:58. The Scout Blackhawk hovered for only 3 seconds before easing the skids against the outer pad. The rotors never stopped spinning. The crew chief cracked the side door and stepped out first, hand steady on the frame rail. Nora followed second. She carried the weight in her legs. It didn't show in her pace, only in how she walked. Her boots hit the tarmac clean, though the left one left a smear of dried blood with each step. She moved behind the gurney as it rolled. Her flight suit was streaked with ash and dirt. Her harness was scuffed and unlatched, left open across her front. No insignia showed. Only the small call sign patch barely clinging to her shoulder. Dust off 3 smeared but legible. The med team met her halfway across the lane. One of them reached for the stretcher, then paused. His eyes scanned the gear, then her face. Recognition took a second. He didn't say anything, just nodded and took the handle from her grip. She stepped back without a word. They wheeled the Marine toward the emergency canopy. The last light above the pad flickered once, then held. A medic brushed past her and didn't stop. Another passed without looking. That was fine. No one owed her a greeting. Colonel Morris stood at the edge of the perimeter fence. His hands were behind his back. He didn't call out. He didn't move to intercept. He just watched. Nora didn't speak to him. She passed by the hangar wall, cut left near the maintenance bay, and entered the tool area through the rear access. The lights inside were dimmed, one flickering above the workbench where the spare parts log stayed unlocked. She peeled off her gloves, what remained of them, and set them beside the crate of latch pins. Her hands were raw. She didn't clean them yet. Inside the bench drawer was a logbook, standard issue, corners worn soft. She opened it to the next clean page and pulled a pen from the rack. She listed the coordinates first: launch time, grid square, descent vector, casualty status critical, stabilized, no tail number, no aircraft recovery, just vehicle compromised, skid failure, field evac executed. At the bottom, she wrote a single-line mission complete, crew extracted, no loss of life. She didn't include her name. There was no box for it. She closed the log and slid it back into place. A fuel cart rolled across the gravel behind the hangar. One tech passed without looking up. Another was adjusting a pressure gauge near the wash rack. Nora unlatched her cracked helmet and set it beside the gloves. The inner lining still carried the heat from her scalp. She didn't adjust it. She just stepped back from the bench and sat on the stool beside the rig wall. For a few minutes, nothing moved. The base was quiet, that brief hour between shift rotations when even the most wired crew paused for breath. That hour didn't need announcements. It belonged to those who showed up early and stayed late without asking who would notice. At 22:24, the outer door opened. Colonel Morris entered the hangar, didn't speak. He held a slip of paper, folded in half. It was already signed. He didn't hand it to her. He just placed it on the bench and left the same way he came in. She didn't touch it right away. She sat with her hands folded. Blood dried at the cuticle. Dust streaked across her sleeves. Only when she exhaled once did she lean forward and glance at the page. Reassign call sign, dust off 3, full mission reinstated. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She folded the paper once and slid it into the side pouch of her pack, the one usually reserved for flight gloves. Outside, the tower rotated to new watch. A red stripe on the board now marked upcoming airframes. Her name was at the top. No announcement, no orders given, just her last name, printed clear. Evans, inside the workbench locker. She set the mission chart she'd used earlier back into the map sleeve. The grease pencil mark from mid-flight still traced the adjusted descent. She didn't erase it. She wiped her hands once on a dry rag, then reached for a clean clip from the supply bin. She resecured the side panel note tab on her medbay rig, not because anyone told her to, but because she'd noticed it had slipped slightly out of alignment. That detail mattered. Across the tarmac, someone turned on the flood lamps over Bay 2. A crew chief dragged a hose cart to the wash station. Another pilot leaned against the supply trailer, sipping something hot from a dented mug. He squinted when he saw her through the gap in the hangar doorway. It took him a second to realize who she was. He didn't say anything, but he stood a little straighter. The sun broke across the horizon at 05:42. A thin orange line stretched over the tarmac, softening the angles of the hangars and turning the dust gold. The base stirred with the usual rhythm boots on gravel, power carts humming, coffee heating and mess tents already half full. The briefing board in the ops tent had been wiped and rewritten before most crews arrived. Names rolled down the list, red marker still fresh. At the very top was one no one expected to see. Evans, call sign reinstated. Dust off 3, status full rotation. Colonel Morris stood by the map rack with a file tucked under one arm. His coffee steamed quietly in his other hand. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't explain the change. He just waited as the rotation filled in around him. The first few to notice said nothing. One junior pilot leaned close, pretending to scan the altitudes, then froze at the top line. He stepped back without comment. Another nudged a crewmate, then shrugged when no response came. Nora hadn't been in the tent yet. She'd been in the hangar since before the overhead lights buzzed on. Her gloves were already mended, stitching visible where the seams had torn. Her helmet sat upright on the bench beside the logbook drawer, clean but not polished. The inner band had been replaced again. The adhesive holding her name tag had started to curl. She pressed it flat. Her boots were scrubbed, but not new. The left one still bore a crease near the sole, a narrow reminder of the ridge rocks that had scraped it down. She moved slowly but deliberately, checking the seal lines on the forward med kit. One buckle clicked too softly. She replaced the latch. At 06:07, she walked the perimeter of her bird. The Blackhawk wasn't technically hers, not by record, but she had flown it more times than anyone else on base, even if half those flights had gone unlogged. She checked the exhaust collar by touch, ran her fingers under the tail vent, then crouched low to inspect the skid base. Weld lines held. The new left brace had been bolted in overnight, tight and balanced. She didn't run a checklist. She didn't need to, but she looked at each component as if she were about to fly. At 06:19, she opened her locker and pulled out a new chart sleeve. Inside were 2 fresh terrain overlays, hand-copied the night before. She slid a note card behind the first sheet, marked only with a single number, 11:23. The time she had lifted off the previous morning. No annotation, just time. In the mess tent, a few crews swapped stories about power outages at a nearby checkpoint. One complained about the ration load. Another asked where the extra flight gloves had gone. No one brought up the name change on the board. Not out loud. Outside the hangar, one of the same pilots from the previous day walked past. He had smirked when she'd been skipped on the mission list. He didn't smirk now. He paused in the doorway, saw her tightening a tie-down clip near the forward bay, and nodded once. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. Just real. She met his eyes, nodded back, then returned to what she was doing. The toolkit beside her had been reloaded with precision. Nothing missing, nothing out of place. The grease pencil sat on top of the case, sharpened and ready. She picked it up, turned it once in her fingers, and set it inside the cockpit tray. At 06:32, the first wave of rotation entered the flight line. Crews formed small clusters. Ground techs moved power carts into place. One medic asked who was running Dust Off 3 today. The answer came as a shrug. No one had to say it. Nora stepped into the Blackhawk. Didn't climb into the seat, just rested a hand on the yoke for a beat. Her thumb traced the base of the flight control. No cracks, no dust. Everything felt as it should. She turned, walked back to the bench, and folded a spare towel over her forearm. Not part of the kit. just habit. Colonel Morris passed near the hangar at 06:48. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. But his pace slowed. Just enough to show he'd seen her. Just enough to know she'd seen the board. She didn't salute. He didn't expect her to. When the second wave entered the ops tent, the top line was still there. Her name hadn't been moved. No initials scribbled in the margin. No asterisk. Just one line, clean, clear. Evans, Dustoff 3, active. Inside the hangar, she placed her chart on the edge of the bench. Her thumb rested on the corner, where the paper had begun to tear. She didn't tape it. She just held it, like it belonged exactly where it was. No ceremony, no applause. But everyone knew.